the oh, just heard recording in progress. Good. Okay, welcome everybody to the second in our month of adventures, and the sort of subtitled "Going with the Trouble" section. Where's this come about from? Well, I've been doing bits and pieces of work about the human and the non-human, and places and thickening places recently. So so this theme came up, and particularly the ideas of Donna Haraway and the Thylacine, the idea of the Thylacine, and her take on this was initially troubling the idea. This isn't the trouble part of going with the trouble, but troubling the idea or problematizing the idea of the Anthropocene. And as soon as I started to read some of that, I personally immediately identified that the idea that we're able to address major global issues by sort of fiddling about as a bunch of human beings who merely scratched the surface of the earth for less than 1 million years. So you know, and the earth's an awful lot older than that, and is going to be around for a lot longer than that. So it's a curious position, and the whole idea of the Anthropocene is the aspect that requires, according to Haraway, requires some rethinking, some revision, because currently we're seeing everything from a human-centric through a human-centric lens. So sorry about the chunk of text here. There are one or two more, but basically this was a synopsis that I found. Haraway outlines a conceptual frame for thinking about or thinking with humans and non-humans in times of heavy losses in life and quality of environment. And that so her, as I've just said, her conceptual frame is the Thylacine, and she uses these two other devices, one already coined by other theorists, the Anthropocene, and the Capitalocene, which lend themselves too readily to cynicism, defeatism, and self-certain and self-fulfilling predictions. So part of the issues there then are that because human beings create these paradigms around the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene, there's either frankly quite daft attempts to say we've got it all under control, as Boris Johnson announced last week in the Guardian, you know, saying, oh well, we've pretty much nailed it now at COP26, so everything's fine. We've set some high targets and that'll be all right. And it is, again, it's this feeling that, you know, sort of humans and particularly politicians scratching at the surface. The Thylacine, alternatively, is made up of ongoing multi-species stories, easy for me to say, stories and practices of becoming with in times that remain at stake, precarious times in which the world is not finished and the sky has not fallen yet. In the Thylacine, humans are not the only important actors. They, along with other beings, are with and of the earth, and the biotic and abiotic powers of this earth are the main story. So it's taking away the sort of human-centeredness as suggested by the Anthropocene. So these few words about the inadequacies, which I've taken this from the paper that inspired this particular track, I suppose. So it's taken from her Going with the Trouble paper. The inadequacies of the current paradigms being the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene. So her preferred terminology, I'm just trying to not see the thumbnails. That's better. Her terminology for the environmental crisis origin is particularly, she really focuses on the Capitalocene. So she generally seems to view the Anthropocene as a kind of a theoretical mistake, a mispositioning of our ontological view of the world and worldview. But in both cases, it's argued that species man per se is less of the problem. It's the hegemonic world system and capitalist world ecology that's the real right at the heart of it. And so she puts forward this a series of criticisms of the term the Anthropocene, and by implication the Capitalocene. So the myth associated with anthropos sets up a story that already seems to end badly. So we're already sort of wringing our hands saying what a problem man has, or human species has created. Species man does not make history. Man plus tool does not make history. It might dig part of the earth up and so on, but does not make history. History, in fact, she takes major issues with the whole concept of history, and that we should give way to geo stories and Gaia stories, story of the earth as an entire complex organism, which she refers to more via string theory, but we'll come to that. So the social apparatus of the Anthropocene tends to be top heavy and bureaucracy prone, which means, of course, that reactions and responses and engagements and being withs are slowed, partial, and too late. And despite reliance on computer modeling and systems theories, Anthropocene discourse is marked by bounded utilitarian individualism. And I'm just going to break into that concept right now. Bounded utilitarian individualism. I think that particular concept is especially significant for what we want, some of the things that we want to talk about today. If we're thinking about tourism and so on, bounded utilitarian individualism, what's that mean? Well, it's about the idea of immediate functionality, the immediacy of individual needs, that we must have it now. Things like, oh, I need a holiday, that sort of notion. But those needs as well, we desperately need land for cattle so that we can make cheaper burgers or whatever. So we've got deforestation, holiday travel, luxury confined and confected as a form of consumption, the ideal forms of leisure as idleness rather than doing things, and the daftness of aspects of COP26. So she's very fond of the words of Virginia Woolf, who says, think we must. And what she's explaining there is that we must think differently. We must flip thinking. So away from the Anthropocene and what human beings have done and can do, away from individualized greed and capital and money, from its hidden effects. And I added alienation in particular, because alienation is a major driver to these individualized consumption patterns. And the story of species man as the agent of the Anthropocene, as she describes it, an almost laughable rerun of the great phallic humanizing and modernizing adventure. So she uses one of our terms in her, but of course she's talking about the adventure of modernity, industrialization, and indeed capitalism. So her solution, or her challenge, her polemic is towards tentacular thinking. And she gets it from, well, part of it is an account of this spider and how this spider can occur in various parts of the world apart from where it naturally occurs. And that got her to thinking about the ways in which all sorts of beings are involved in the world, are being with the world in many different locations in many different ways. So she says tentacularity is about life lived along lines. And some of the themes that she uses are things like mycelia, roots, currents, knots, and clouds. So all of these things that we readily find in the natural world, and yet in our organized human worlds, we tend to have these many of those structures kind of flattened out and bureaucratized, of course. Earth, or Gaia, is maker and destroyer, not a resource to be exploited. I think it's quite interesting that Haraway focuses on the idea that Gaia can be abundant, can provide food and shelter and so on, but also part of nature is that it destroys things. There are fires, floods, and storms, and so on. Not a resource to be exploited, or ward to be protected, or nursing mother promising nourishment. Gaia is not a person. So in other words, we should not anthropomorphize Gaia, the notion of Gaia, not a person, but a complex systemic phenomena, but complex series of systemic phenomena that compose a living planet. Gaia is an intrusive event that undoes thinking as usual. So this is part of the going with the trouble. We need to undo thinking as usual, and various, climate. It's important to have climate summits and so on, but it's also mundane behaviours and mundane thinking that needs to be adjusted. Human histories must give way to geo stories, to Gaia stories, webbed, braided, and tentacular living and dying in symbiotic multi-species string figures. Now, I included the word symbiotic multi-species in there, and I confess that I couldn't give you a proper explanation of what that particular word was. I just lifted it directly from Haraway. So after this introduction, if someone wants to explain that bit, but what I'm really taking is her idea of the webbed, braided, tentacular living and dying, positive and negative, all interwoven, and this is part of her being with thesis. And the idea that these were not her words, we're all lichens now, lichens, lichens in the Thylacine. So the idea that life is symbiotic, so that what we do has a kind of opposite effect or a related effect, and that most plants and animals and stones and mountains and seas are part of a symbiotic whole, ultimately, which comprise Gaia. And this is where she begins to talk about making kin, actually beginning those connections, making stories and storying the stories. So extending stories and linking them, connecting them across species and things. So it's not dominance of nature, not dominance of the planet, not conquering mountains and seas, but being with. And therefore, going with that trouble, whatever happens. So away from the idea as well, she talks about a kind of a masculinized view of theories of evolution as kind of natural competition and survival, and towards a more evolution as evolving together with. Very bad slide, and I do apologize, conclusions and futures. So firstly, we must think. And one of her statements is that the unfinished Thylacine must collect up the trash of the Anthropocene, the extremist of the Capitalocene, and chipping and shredding and layering like a mad gardener, make a much hotter compost pile for still possible pasts, presents, and futures. The coral and lichen symbionts also bring us richly into the storied tissues of the thickly present Thylacine, where it remains possible, just about, to play a much better SF game in non-arrogant collaboration with all of those in the muddle. And when she says all of those, again, we're way beyond human, way beyond species necessarily, and so on. So bringing it back down to us and all the things that we want to talk about in outdoor education, leisure studies, tourism, and our mundane everyday, how shall we proceed? How shall we think? And what will we do? Is adventure even desirable? Should we break up the band? How can we begin to be with? How can we shift that thinking and become symbiotically entwined? We are, whether we like it or not. How do we acknowledge it and share those understandings and make them stick? What price do we still have, considering adventure as the great masculinized vanity project of self or selfish identity and heroism? How do we find a way beyond all of that? Okay, so that was a bit of a sort of a bit of a presentation, really, to stimulate thinking amongst the audience, I guess, and presenters, in case they want to respond to some of those ideas as they go through it. But I think, unless there are any immediate comments right now, we'll go to Chris's presentation. Yelena?
I'm here.
Yeah, Chris?
And I'll share my screen shortly. And Pete, just thank you for that first before we move forward. And just the call to this event, think I must as a result of that. So, and it isn't easy, this challenge, but then why would it be? So let's see where it took me. I'll just share my screen now. And just if you could confirm that you can see that, that'd be great.
Yes, yeah, can see that, Chris.
Magic, thank you very much. So I'm Chris Loynes from the University of Cumbria. And recently we were talking in our department about a possible new degree. And we were debating whether it should be called adventure tourism, playing to the fact that our local national park has branded itself the adventure capital of England, or whether we should call it ecotourism, following the recent trends in rewilding, nature restoration, and the reintroduction of species in our part of the world. That includes beaver and lynx and eagles. That just reminded me of this problematic dichotomy between the ecology, the biology, if you like, of our relationships with nature, and the adventure relationship with nature, which is perhaps more to do with the physics, the elements, and hence the title for the talk. And looking for some starting points for this, I found Eric Breimer's work on extreme outdoor activists, such as this base jumper in a squirrel suit here, and where Eric found that the risk of their activity was not really in their minds at all. It was something that had to be managed in order for them to have the experience. But what the experience was they were seeking was an intense integration, interplay, interaction, relationship with the elements of their chosen activity, in this case, rock, air, and gravity. And that was, I felt, very encouraging, in that, in one sense, there's adventurers, they were also environmentalists, interested in those particular elements of the environment. I should say, by the way, that this presentation is coming from an Anglophone position. I say that because I will be questioning some of our concepts and some of our language that we use in English. And I'd be fascinated to know if other cultures have other concepts and other words that could be more helpful in the challenge that I'm about to take on. And what I want to do is to explore whether that dichotomy between adventure tourism and ecotourism and its various cousins can in some way be resolved by this new idea of the wild. And that's the thought experiment that I want to follow. Also, You don't need to be in a squirrel suit jumping from a high cliff to become intimately related with the elements. And later on, I'll reveal what exactly it is I'm doing here with something stuck in my ear close to the river. So I'm going to offer a series of thought pieces that help me with this question. And the first was my own personal experience of the time I spend out and about, which I've never thought of as divided in this way between ecology and adventure, between an eco or an adventure experience. I enter landscapes. I like to move through landscapes in different ways so that I'm interacting with them, that I have a relationship, that it is dynamic, that it is two-way, and not just a view, that I can engage in that way with wildlife, with seascapes, with landscapes, and where they're present with the culture as well. And that was an important starting point for me, that perhaps for lots of others, this is a false dichotomy. It doesn't actually capture what people actually value or actually do, like the person in the squirrel suit. Tim Ingold would call that wayfaring, perhaps, and that links well back to the use of strings and lines in Donna Haraway's thinking. Another starting point for me was a piece of work I did about 15 years ago, where I was asking different adventure activists if they had any direct experience of climate change through their activity. And the answer was no, 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 until I got to surface. And when I said to ask the question to surface, they said, well, yes, of course. The waves have changed. They've got bigger, they're steeper, the sets come in differently, and they're more frequently large. And of course, they knew, because it's part of their game, where these waves come from, that they're generated by storms on the other side of the ocean, and that those storms are getting deeper and more frequent because of climate change. But their knowledge of this change in the environment was embodied. It was coming through that intimate relationship with the waves and noticing that they had to respond differently in order to pursue their sport. They also commented that some of the breaks were already disappearing and new breaks were opening up just from the small changes in sea level that we've already seen. My own experience of that intimate, and the word intimate's the one I want to hang on to there, that intimate relationship, embodied intimate relationship with the environment comes through sailing. It's probably my most passionate activity. I sail a lot in the Sea of the Hebrides, sometimes for quite long periods of time. And in those longer periods of time, I find myself making decisions about what to do with no obvious place for the information that's caused me to make those choices. I might shorten sail, change course, seek shelter, but I can't point to any evidence in the environment around me to tell me why I've made that call. Yet almost always 20 minutes later, it becomes very obvious why I made that call and that it was the right call to make. There is this embodied knowing of the places that we are in that reminds me of what anthropologists say about indigenous peoples living in traditional ways and the knowledge that they have of the places that they are in because of that intimate engagement that we don't have. There is a muscle that we're not exercising or haven't exercised for a very long time, but it's there and it can be recovered and it can be redeployed. And it's good to pay attention, to attune to it and to trust it. And maybe it occurred to me that that is what this idea of the wild means, that it isn't a place, it isn't a thing, it's a relationship between all of the elements of the world, and it is our experience of those elements, a process, a verb, not a noun. I took that idea into a workshop in our local wild place, Wild Ennerdale, which is probably the oldest project, rewilding project in England. And I took a group of people there with me, and we asked ourselves, how do we engage with this supposedly wild place in order to highlight these processes rather than the objects within it, but the processes going on amongst ourselves and amongst it. We tried various activities to amplify and accelerate that kind of way of engaging with it. We tried bushcraft, we tried creative activities, storytelling, body work like yoga and Tai Chi. And people were set off to explore the valley over a couple of days. The end of that, most people came back still seeing it as a set of objects, and indeed not really seeing it as wild. The Sitka spruce plantations, which have yet to be felled to make way for the regenerating woodland, were very domestic to their eye, as were the wild cattle reintroduced to be the dominant large herbivore in the system, looked too much like domestic cattle. Where there was a sense of the wild, it was in the river, which has had all of the human constraints upon it removed. And it's really changing and adjusting its course regularly as it runs down the valley. And it looks more like Canada than England when you get used, when you see it. It looks quite unusual. And I think, again, it's those vigorous elements that seem to be capturing us most. There's something there about the air for the base jumper, the surf, the weather for a sailor. These more vigorous elements seem to be where we can sense the wild first. There was one story from one participant who went into the woods and saw a deer, and he followed that deer, and the deer stayed within sight. Time and time again, he could look around, look up, and there was the deer still just within sight. And he followed it for a considerable amount of time. And he said, by being deer, by being with the deer, another word Pete mentioned from Haraway, that he felt he had seen the forest from a wilder perspective, seen it in a different view through a different lens. And in fact, part of the storytelling of that week, a whole fictional story was created out of that to represent the wild. Phil Mullins writes about this process of becoming expert at being in the environments and sensing them in this wild way, this embodied, interrelated way. And he says the more expert a fly fisher person becomes, the more they are attuned to the environment, the more they become fish, the more they become river. To the point where, for them, it's much the motivation for going fly fishing becomes about that sense of attunement, and catching the fish is neither here nor there. In the literature, you'll find quite a lot of similar accounts made by people who go hunting. And Phil Mullins has also demonstrated the same process going on for canoeists. So maybe we needed to spend more time in that other place, that wild Ennerdale, in order to become expert enough to begin to understand the processes at work and to wild ourselves in that wilder place. A colleague of mine, Lisa Fenton, who was with me in Ennerdale, has taken that a step further and has asked the question, can we use these activities not only to re-engage with the wild processes in these faraway places that we value, but whether we can actually take these activities back into our domestic settings and to rediscover the wild in our domestic worlds. And recently she's been running workshops and is planning a module to take place in the centre of London to rediscover that wild relationship with the wildness that's all around people in an urban area as much as it might be in a faraway and more valued natural setting. And that idea of home, whether to be at home in a faraway place or to bring the wild home to our everyday homes, reminded me of a story where I was talking with an Aboriginal ranger in a conference in Australia, and we were comparing the word bush with the word wilderness. And I was describing
Sorry,
wilderness.
Chris, I need to interrupt you. There's 2 minutes left for your presentation.
Thank you, that's perfect. And I was telling him what wilderness meant to me, that it was a hostile place where I could go for a limited time and I had to live with the things that were in my rucksack and then leave, and that I might get lost and I might not find my way home. And when I said that, he said immediately, oh no, it's not the same thing. How could I be lost in the bush? How could I be lost in my own home? I always know where I am. And I thought it was a really profound comment about how our wild places are, of course, the homes for others. But he then twinkled at me and said, of course, because I know where I am when I'm in the bush, Doesn't mean I always know where everywhere else is. In other words, he also had other places, but for him, those were our urban settings, not his bush. And that leads me to wonder whether the wild as a verb and as a set of embodied relationships back and forth with all the elements of nature is something we can begin to explore as a value for how we are in these faraway places we visit, so that we become expert. Or maybe it's also a value we can bring home and explore to discover the wild on our doorsteps. And this is 5 miles down the road from where I live. And to the left is the busy shipbuilding port of Barrow-in-Furness, where we build submarines. And to the right is a large grey seal colony and a seabird breeding colony on the edge of the Irish Sea. And here it's a wonderful place to go with binoculars, with a sea kayak, with a sailboard, or whatever is your fancy, a local place to become expert at being at home in a wild way with all of these elements. And what was I doing with that straw in my ear? It's a hollow reed. And if you put one end in your ear and the other end on a rock on the bed of the river, you can hear the sound of the water moving underwater, not the sound of the surface, but the sound of the water underwater gets translated into your ear, and gives a whole new perspective of how to experience one of the elements without having to jump off a high cliff in a squirrel suit, I'm glad to say, just getting wet knees. I'll leave you with that activity to try out if you fancy. Thank you very much. And somehow I can get out of this. There we go.
Thanks, Chris. Fantastic. So rewilding from within, in essence, is that that's part of it?
It's wilding ourselves, yes. And what is it about us that is wild, that can respond in relationship with all these others, other than humans, but not just animals and plants, but also the elements? And that's what I think can bring the adventure and the ecological back together in a single holistic approach, possibly in these wonderful places we privilege for our adventures and our eco trips, but also perhaps at home.
Yeah, in more mundane spaces. So
yeah,
and direct answer to my challenge. So very good. So the next presenter, if they can load up their files, if there are any urgent comments right now for Chris, just while that's happening, but we'll keep it short and move on to the next presentation, which, hang on.
Yep, we have Tove, and it's raised.
I just have a quick question and a comment, and that is, first of all, now I have tons of stuff I'm looking forward to reading. Thank you so much, Chris, for giving all of those great sources to us also. But also we have to remember that what is wild to us or exotic to us is often the home to others, right? So our home might just as well be as exotic to somebody else coming in, right? So the idea there, I think, is just as much to recognize what exotic means. That's from a personal standing, and then to discover what it is that others see exotic in us, in ourselves, right? I think that's a nice message.
Yeah, one of the things that I did some years ago was work with children from those islands in the Hebrides, which I visit so much, who are in schools of maybe only 5 or 10 children, and we went to the city together. And we came together to form an orchestra, and we came together to have a football match with 11 players on each side. So yeah, I get your point. Well made, thank you.
Okay, Karina. Are you able to share your presentation? Okay, I think that was that Hin?
Yeah, it sounds as if Hin does not have any sound. Is she lacking rights, maybe?
Sometimes the sound doesn't work if somebody's using the headphones.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, sorry, I also had to leave just 1 minute. So Hin is presenting on our behalf. Maybe Hin, if you can hear us, try to exit and come back in. Sorry about this.
I tried to send her a direct message.
Yeah.
But there's been no response.
Well, she's out now, and maybe she's trying to enter again very quickly. I'm sorry, I thought our presentation was the next one, not the one following this one.
Well, yeah, that might be. Was that because as we've moved Scott Duke's presentation because it's the recorded one?
Okay.
Just because of times.
Yeah. Because it's a little later here, so we have little kids, so and working from home, so it's yeah, I'm sure you're aware, staying with the trouble also in that sense. Well, I mean, while we wait for him, maybe I can just say a few words about the project. So I just landed from Greenland very late last night, so I haven't had any chance to really familiarize myself with all this. But we are a couple of researchers working on a project on cruise tourism in the Arctic, sustainable Arctic cruise communities, and for our project, one of the central tenets or the concepts that we're working around is Donna Haraway's concept of staying with the trouble. And the reason why we decided to do that is that what we see in the Arctic is kind of often a dichotomized discussion between people that sees cruise tourism as an opportunity to develop societies and for profit and different other aspects, and on the other hand also a lot of controversy around cruise tourism for good reason. And so what we saw in some of the discussions that we've had with communities, so this is in the Nordic, Norway, Iceland, Russia, and also Greenland, is that it's not going away. So while we might not like it or think that it's harmful for the environment and for communities, we need to find ways to stay with the trouble. We are not going to be fixing, as Donna Haraway talks about, to fix cruise tourism. It's not going away, and we need to find ways in which to tinker with it, to develop ways in which we can slowly and in modest and patient ways try to work around this phenomena. And also thinking across, as you also described in your earlier presentations, across the human. So this is not going to be a technological quick fix or one that depends on humans alone. And so this was what he was going to present. And now I feel that I'm a little bit running out of time just without any slides and without kind of a support. And I don't know why she's not back. So I was thinking maybe we could have some questions or a little discussion or something. I don't know.
Yeah, don't worry, I'll leave you struggling there. I wonder if actually what we do is move to Josh Bennett's presentation and give him an opportunity to come back. But thanks for that. It does sound really interesting, and this kind of amelioration of the challenges that are, that come with cruise tourism. I know here in Sondel, they've been doing a lot of that, trying to get people off the boat and go for a little sea kayak along the fjord and, have a little meal in the woods and things. But yeah. So there's some of these ideas. Yeah. But I wonder, Josh, is that possible? Can you load up yours and start your presentation, and then we'll see if Hin's able to do something in a bit.
No problem.
All right. Thanks,
okay.
Corinne.
I'm just gonna load up real quick here. All right. Hope you can see that. All right, everybody, how's it going? Can you hear me? Yeah. All right. This is really great to be here. It's really fantastic to be able to speak with you all. And I'm calling in today from Oslo, Norway, although I'm actually originally from United States. Came over here to Europe originally to study actually in the Transcultural European Outdoor Studies program, the University of Cumbria and here in Oslo. And since then I've been working here in Oslo in tourism, particularly as a bicycle and hiking tour guide, also working in education and in other programs, social programs here. And I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about what I call wild tourism, a guided tour at the intersection of outdoor education and tourism. So yeah, I already told you a little bit. Here's some visuals. I kind of jumped ahead a little bit, but yeah, I like to think of what I do here as kind of eco-social work, a jack of all trades, educator in and outside of the classroom. You can see me over here with my students at the climate march here in Oslo from social studies class, as well as you see me over here. We're doing tours. I've been a tour guide here pretty much. It's been my bread and butter, keeping me going through my time here in Oslo, and more recent times been producing the Transnatural Perspectives podcast, where we bring people from all around the world, like we have here today, to talk about different processes and ways of working with and within the outdoors. So this idea of wild, when we talk about wild tourism, I'm taking from this idea of wild pedagogies from this book right here, Wild Pedagogies, Touchstones for Renegotiating Education in the Environment in the Anthropocene. Now that I know a bit more about the Chuluthocene, this is an interesting maybe regression a little bit. You know, the title kind of says it all, and Wild Pedagogies aims to renegotiate what it means to be a human in relationship with the world by engaging in deep and transformational change through the use of educational practices. I thought that this was like a really nice framework, especially when approaching tourism, which I predominantly work in, because I think a lot of the time, especially if you're studying in outdoor education, this could just be me, this could just be how I viewed it, but a lot of the time I think tourism is almost seen as something different. Education, we're imagining, oh, maybe I'm going to be working in schools, outdoor schools, forest schools, or going to be maybe outdoor therapists or something like this. And tourism is kind of this other genre. But nowadays, I really like to look at myself as kind of a teacher on a bike. And there's a lot of good reasons to start thinking about tourism, if we haven't already, in a way of an opportunity to disseminate information from all other walks of the outdoor field and concerns of sustainability and whatnot. So, regardless of what you thought when you're back in school, or what you might become, the truth is, and this is the quote, of course, before Corona, I don't know exactly the statistics now, but in 2018, global adventure tourism industry was valued at approximately $80 billion more than the global outdoor education industry. So at least in pre-pandemic times, these numbers were expected to respectively double by 2026. So what does that mean? That means if you've got skills in the outdoors, if you're good with working with people and you're looking for a job, you might actually end up working in tourism than actually in education. So how can we bring kind of the education into the tourism? And I also like to ask these questions, which taken from previous presenter, my previous professor, Chris Loynes. How could outdoor practitioners contest the status quo in a landscape of increasingly McDonaldized offerings? So we see these McDonaldized offerings, these kind of pre-packaged trips, pre-packaged school programs, all this kind of stuff, that kind of commodifying nature, commodifying the outdoor experience. So how can we kind of stay true to our values and progress towards a more sustainable future? So going back to wild pedagogies, if you they give you in this kind of a theoretical breakdown of how to renegotiate your interactions with the outdoors. They give you kind of a checklist of what you can do as a practitioner. I'm not going to read the whole thing because I'm about to go through it, but I was kind of filtering my process of being a tour guide and how I can kind of rewild being a tour guide, or how am I doing that as well. And I suggest that maybe you go ahead and do this in wherever you practice. It's a very I don't know, it's a feel-good activity, and it helps you kind of gauge where you are and where you want to go with your practice. So I asked the question, how can these touchstones of wild pedagogy be applied to the context of a growing industry that's increasingly dominated by capitalism and commodified excess? Sometimes tourism industry can be like that. So one of the first touchstones is being with nature as a co-teacher. And how do we do this? So, you know, as a tour guide, we're kind of the constant on a tour. We're there before the tourist, after the tourist, we're there, you know, day in and day out. So we have the opportunity to kind of reflect and renegotiate on the landscape, and not just the natural landscape, but like in my case, the urban landscape. Oslo, where I live, we're very much on the fringes where the urban meets the rural and the wild. It's all kind of interwoven throughout the city. Then we can, I typically will, like, you know, interpret the landscape, and then I see it as the duty of the guide or whoever the practitioner is to communicate this in a respectful way, respectful to your co-teacher, the nature. And it's also important to allow space for nature to interrupt and speak for itself, remind perhaps you what you're there to talk about, and also to lead the conversation. I put this boat here because so often when I'm doing a boat trip and I'm taking people out on boats into the fjords and whatnot, we get so much conversation just from the noise that the water makes against the boat. People start asking, what's the fjord, and how was the fjord made? So we talk a lot about the past, the glacial melt, and then we talk a lot about the future, what's happening with the glaciers today. So it's just the nature itself is a great guide and great conversation starter. Now, as we move on, one of the next touchstones is the complexity of the unknown and spontaneity, being able to deal with spontaneity. A lot of the time on tour, it might be preconceived that there's not so much spontaneity. We have talking points, we have routes, we have logistics, things that we need to take care of. However, there is quite a bit of liminal space on these tours, on even a short 3-hour tour like the tours I do most of the time, where there is very much opportunity for improvisation, sometimes out of your control, construction, you know, just chit chat along the way. And of course, people take breaks along the way too. So there's a lot of opportunity there as a facilitator to kind of adapt with your previous knowledge and the ability to kind of navigate beyond the unknown, kind of transcend the unknown. The tourists are in the unknown, and there's a lot of unknown things happening, but there you as a guide can kind of use that to kind of facilitate an enjoyable and effective experience in the face of the inevitable spontaneity. Next touchstone that they mention here in the wild pedagogy's touchstone is, are we locating the wild? This is the question that we're asking. Are we locating the wild? The wild can be occluded, made hard to see by cultural tools, by colonial orientation of those doing the encountering, and in the urban spaces by concrete itself. I'm thinking back to what we were just talking about, how wild spaces can be urban spaces too, and we talk about concrete jungles. Now here in Oslo, it's pretty easy to locate the wild. There's wild interwoven throughout the urban area, but really what the great opportunity of being on a tour is if you have the ability to facilitate and point attention to whatever you find important, whatever message you want to convey, you have a captive audience. And I find this very unique as a tour guide and as a teacher. As a teacher, you don't always have a captive audience. You have a lot of people that are, you know, coming to your class, a lot of kids coming to your class. They may or may not want to be there, but you have a really unique opportunity as a tour guide you have people that are paying usually to listen to you, to be there. So it's a lot of opportunity. If you can deliver the right message, if you can show and you can tell things that are producing some meaning, you have a lot of opportunity to renegotiate perspectives of your audience in a short amount of time. It's pretty unique. It's unprecedented, really. As for time and practice, speaking of time, we are moving along here. So time and practice. So we talk a lot about clock time. Of course, this is very relevant on a tour. If you're in tourism, it's all about, you know, this, that, and the other thing. We've got to get here at this point, get here at this point. So we've got to limits and logistics and all kinds of stuff like that. So is there an opportunity for deep time, for reflection, for engaging in rituals, and reflection on these rituals? I say yes. I found in my practice, be it short, we have a lot of things going on. People putting on helmets, taking off helmets, parking their bikes, locking things up. People get into this kind of pattern and motion. We kind of create a micro culture, even in this very short amount of time, giving breaks for people to explore independently on their own. It's another significant opportunity. Might not seem much to those behind the scenes, but for a tourist who just got off a cruise ship, first time in Oslo, they have 20 minutes to go walk around a park by themselves and enjoy the nature. It's quite a big deal. This is their first experience. And then to return back to the group, have some very brief reflections is another great opportunity to create little micro reflective experiences, even in a short period of time. So you can ask yourself, how can I facilitate deep time within clock time constraints, especially if you're a tour guide? This is a good thing to think about. And last but not least, socio-cultural change, building alliances, and human community. Let's reflect on this for a moment. A key concept of wild pedagogy thus far is the belief that education is always a political act. So yes, this can be difficult in tourism, especially when you have paying customers, whatnot, to engage in political discussion, although it definitely happens and it can be a lot of fun and it can be very enriching. But I'm thinking more that through the experience, what you as a facilitator show and tell, the message that you deliver, doesn't need to be proselytizing, doesn't need to be dogmatic, but simply by showing and telling, having this captive audience, you choose the kind of message that you want to deliver and reach people in a short amount of time. So it's good to think about, what is my responsibility? What am I showing and telling? What am I focusing on? And I know as a tour guide and a trainer of other guides, I've seen this go all kinds of ways. It can go very well and go not so well, depending on what kind of information and how you read your crowd and what kind of, meaning you want to create out of this experience. So you're in our closing circle.
We lost you, Josh.
Yeah, I saw I was muted. Yes. So just
sorry, Josh, you have a couple of minutes left.
Oh yeah, this is our final slide here. Closing circle, everybody. So just like to for all the practitioners out there, no matter whether you're on a tour or whether you're in a classroom or whatever you may be doing, we all have the opportunity to be educators from wherever we sit or we stand. Every moment we are moving, we are living, we are representing whatever it is that we want to believe and transmit out to the rest of the world. So in the case of the tour is an ever-changing mobile classroom, but it offers great opportunity, unprecedented access to large audiences to communicate relevant and evidence-based messages in real time. The evidence is right there. I'm pointing at the fantastic architecture that is designed for humans and the landscape to enjoy and have better well-being and quality of life. I'm showing you the amazing classrooms that are outside that people here enjoy, and maybe you can take that information back with you to your home country. So thanks a lot, everybody. Yeah, there we go. It's up to you. Thanks for listening. And if you want any more information about what I do or the podcast, please head over to transnaturalperspectives.com. I'm happy to talk to you. It's very fantastic to be here. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Wonderful. Thanks, Josh. That was great. You and Chris have obviously been chatting together to get such a beautifully sort of dovetailed pair of presentations.
I learned from the best.
Well, so okay. I'm just wondering if Karina or are we ready to present? Yeah, Hin, I can see.
Yeah, Hin, you're there. Yes, so I'll leave the floor to you now.
Well, thank you for this second chance, guys. And I'm really sorry to finish the justice talk because my computer just had a complete meltdown and crash. So I'll try again this time with sharing my screen. And I think you saw my screen last time, but you didn't hear me. But so please let me know if there's anything going wrong this time. So I think you see my screen. It's not in presenter mode yet, and I hope you hear me.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Then I'll just try to do it in presenter mode. I'm very nervous because of my technical meltdown. You know, it really put me off my talk. Well, but hi everybody. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be here. And my name is Lynn Heemstra, and I'm working at the New University in Bodø, also in Norway. The talk or the paper I'm going to talk about is called Cruise Trouble, a practice-based approach to studying Arctic cruise tourism. And this is actually an article that has been fresh from the press this month. And Karina is also with us here now and tried to save the presentation when it went wrong the previous time. She is the first author. And from Aalborg University, we also have Laura James from Aalborg University and Albina Pasquic from Dalarna in Sweden, and myself from Norway. And this paper got published in Tourism Management Perspectives. But when we submitted for the seminar here, it was not accepted yet. So this paper is conceptual, and we really were also...
Sorry to interrupt, but we don't see you switching slides, if that's what you're trying to do. We still see only the first slide. Sorry.
You do? Okay, this is very weird. I don't know why, because I...
It's not in presenter mode either. Now it's switching. Yeah.
Now it's switching. Okay. Then I cannot. I had it in presenter mode on my screen, but then I'm sorry about that. Then I'll just try to do it like this. Thank you. So we are at objectives. This is the point of this paper was to kind of bridge the understanding of, but also the responsibility towards Arctic cruise tourism. Because this paper comes out of a project where we look into the trouble or staying with the trouble of cruise tourism in Arctic regions. And cruise tourism has always kind of been presented as either a progress or a despair for local communities in the Arctic. So we try to apply a practice approach to move away from this kind of deductionist avenues. And we would like to reintroduce Donna Haraway's concept of staying with the trouble as a kind of research positionality. And a little bit, we are also inspired by the work of Huis and Mol, also building further on this relational endeavor, where such an approach does not offer kind of simplistic generalized solutions or a sweeping critique, but proceeds through research efforts that are ongoing, adaptive, tinkering, and open-ended. So we would like to look at the field of cruise tourism and understanding the troubles that it can bring for local communities, and from a relational endeavor as researchers. We identified, therefore, kind of the central themes through a literature study of Arctic cruise tourism. And the troubles of cruise are impacts and stakeholder attitudes. And you probably all have heard about, you know, the cities that are really protesting against cruise tourism arrivals. Our climate change, sustainability, and resilience. Pollution of cruise ships is often discussed. The emissions of cruise ships and how to manage and govern that. So we identify that as the three troubles. But trouble, then we don't see it as an issue to be overcome, but rather a condition that we are in and in which we all become with tourism. So as a researcher, also we are in that. We start from that point of view that we are in the same trouble and become with tourism. We'd like to stay with the trouble through practice and practice theory and practice-based methods. And we see that there has been a growing interest in practice-based approaches to tourism generally and practice-based analysis of cruise tourism more specifically. And here in the paper also we refer to several authors and several research papers. So we conceptualize or reconceptualize Arctic cruise as a practice, as practices, as bundles of practices. And that kind of directs our attention to the performance of cruise-related practices in different destinations. So staying at the level, sorry, somebody is, oh, no, it went okay. So how these practices are reproduced through enrollment of practitioners, for example, tour guides, local craftspeople, who develop skills and competences specific to the practices, and how they take on different meanings. So cruise can be a problem or a panicky depending on who you're talking to and what kind of practices you're looking at and what kind of community you're working with. So a little bit here, I realize that I don't have so much time left, but we'd like to analyze these cruise troubles from a practice perspective by focusing on this materiality of practices and the troubles that arise from this circulation of materials, for example, waste, that are generated through cruise practices. This approach directs our attention to the material arrangements that make cruise tourism possible and how different practices in cruise destinations make use of the same material resources. For example, harbors, fish, infrastructure, and therefore this problem of congestion also is actually a problem of practices and using the same material resources. So we also would like to argue for focusing on the relations then between those practices and the troubles that arise through competition, interference, codependence between these practice bundles in cruise tourism communities. So the practice bundle of fishing, how does it interact with the practice bundle of receiving 2,000 cruise guests in the same harbor? Another critical point here is this flat ontology, where we see this social phenomena and how they exist on one scale and that of practices. We try to trace connections, and we are able to discern practices that relate to a larger constellation of networks, potentially stretching across the globe. So connecting what happens in destinations and cruise communities and try to compare them with each other. In the paper, we also illustrate this with an example of an Arctic beach cleanup. So this is kind of a bundle of trouble or a bundle of practices that is kind of happening all over the Arctic and other places as well. Where the trouble is that cruise tourism on one hand is a source, but on the other hand, a response to the littering of Arctic beaches. So what happens is cruise guests are invited to go beach and to help up cleaning. These practices bundled differently in different settings. As I said, this kind of initiative happens in different places, but who's organizing it, what kind of waste is found, how, who is participating, that can be very different. So the development of new practice bundles can help render communities responsible to major concerns. So this beach cleaning can kind of be a vector and a way to feel that there is a way to respond and do something. So this practice approach focuses on the challenging, taxing, and often modest ways in which people tinker with troubling practices, and then finding ways to adapt, improve, or fight situations they are in. Instead of focusing on the disaster of marine debris or the salvation of cruise operators to policymakers to fix the plastic situation, we argue for staying with relations and motivations connected to these practices. Why are they doing that? Who is involved? What needs to be organized in order to make it happen? So conclusion of this paper is that we argue that this practice approach is one way to help researchers to engage with these complexities of cruise tourism, cruise trouble, and to overcome overly simplified accounts of cruise. But I think this can also be done, of course, in other types of tourism industries and tourism activities. But cruise is a very good way to study this tension between the troubles and the benefits. We also argue that the current COVID-19 pandemic adds to these difficulties and making zooming in from a distance the only option for most researchers. So how can you stay with the practice? How can you follow practice bundles and understand what communities are doing if you cannot go there? Through digital and desktop research, you can kind of enter the field, but there's also other ways like video and photographs that you ask two stakeholders to make and then to discuss that online or having this kind of webinars. However, we also see that going to these communities and following practices gives a deeper understanding and meaning for researchers in order to kind of analyze and share the results in that way. But our point was also for better and for worse, on a larger or smaller scale, Arctic cruise tourism is here to stay. Even though we've seen that a total stop in Norway the last 2 years, the bookings for 22 and 23 and from there already kind of hitting all the breaking all numbers that they had before 2020. So we see that this is going back with a vengeance. So how this develops in and hopefully for active communities needs and deserves more careful thought, work, and deliberation. To kind of also refer again to Haraway, see the interconnections and the tentacles, how cruise tourism as a phenomena is finding its way in communities, but also connecting communities and connecting people with each other across the globe. We would like to thank the Research Council of Norway for supporting the Sustainable Arctic Cruise Communities project, and we have also called from practice to governance, and for which this conceptual article is the first outcome. And we will also have a lot of empirical papers in the making based on our field studies in Greenland, Iceland, Norway, and Russia. So there we try to kind of have this cross-Arctic understanding of bundles of practice and the troubles of cruise, but also how local communities are working with that and becoming resilient through connections that they have with cruise and other actors. Thank you very much. I hope this was not too fast, not too, I don't know how much time I have used. I will just stop sharing.
Thanks very much. I'm so glad you managed to sort that out. That was absolutely superb. Wonderful.
Yeah.
No, it's really great. I've got all sorts of questions about flat ontologies and beach cleaning as a vector and thinking about Chris's reflection and all kinds of things. But we're going to leave that till towards the end and just catch up with our next presenter, who is, we're just, Jelena has just identified that the two next authors talking about flourishing futures don't appear to be present. Duadal and Liebird. Is there anyone here that's presenting on their behalf or anything that we're not aware of? In which case, Jelena, do you want to have a go at showing Scott's video?
Well, I think you should try to do that, just because of the sound. Yeah.
Oh, I knew you were going to say.
Well, I can try as well. Okay.
Go on, have a go.
Okay, please let me know if the sound is picked up.
Jukes. Unfortunately, I can't be there with you live today, and I'm really sorry to be missing the conversations because the topic or the theme of today's webinar is something that really interests me. And I'm going to be talking today about some of my research and practice that relates to this theme. But I'll start by explaining where I am. And so I live in Australia near Melbourne, and I'm currently on Bunurong country. And so the Bunurong people were the traditional owners of this land, and this is land that was stolen during the colonisation of Australia. So I acknowledge that this is unceded land and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And so as I open this presentation on the topic of staying with the trouble, it's important that I acknowledge this dark history and that it's a contested history on these colonised lands. This also gets me to the heart of my presentation today. It's that one of the key messages for me is that there's always multiple stories present in any place. And so this is something that I've come to with my research and with my recent practice with students, that there's always multiple stories present in any place. And some of these stories might be the dominant narrative, whilst other stories might be subjugated, oppressed, silenced, or even ignored. And so a way that we might stay with the trouble in our current epoch is to try and attend to some of these messier or lesser heard stories. But I'll delve more into that later. As I said, my name's Scott Jukes and I'm a lecturer in outdoor and environmental education at Federation University. But before becoming an academic, I worked as a ski guide, a ski instructor, a rafting guide, paddling instructor, outdoor educator, and also worked on adventure therapy programs. So I've come to my role as an academic from a diverse background, which centered a lot around adventure. But as an academic, I'm now teaching students to become outdoor and environmental educators or adventure or nature tourism guides. And so through my practice as a lecturer and as a researcher, I've been exploring ways to look beyond ourselves in outdoor adventure settings and to pay attention to the places that we're in and the more than human worlds that we're participating with. And one of the other things that I am interested in doing is attending to the more than human stories, or the multiple stories that crisscross, shape and make these places that we go and visit. And so as I approach this theme of adventure in the Anthropocene, this may have already been touched on in the introduction, but I guess it's pointing to the fact that human actions are leaving a signature on the strata of the earth. And so for me, adventure in the Anthropocene might mean using adventurous activities as an entryway into some ethical conversations surrounding socio-environmental problems. But it's also important to point out that Haraway alludes that there's something quite anthropocentric about naming a geological epoch full of multiple actors after man or anthropos. But I guess that might be part of a sign of our times that hubristic anthropocentrism is sort of a trait that is part of this Anthropocene discourse. And this quote that I've got on the screen here from Robert McFarlane really resonates with me. And he writes that the rhetorical we of the Anthropocene discourse smooths over severe inequalities and universalises the site-specific consequences of environmental damage. And that's what I try to touch upon in my practice, and what I'll touch upon a bit later on in this presentation, is that some of these broad environmental problems always play out in site-specific ways, and they're always particular. And it's worth, for me, I think, worth touching on some of these specific problems in particular contexts. So part of my thinking in this realm is how might I challenge anthropocentric thought, and how can I challenge anthropocentric practice in outdoor environmental education or adventure education? And so for me, part of that is acknowledging that we live within a more than human world, or within more than human worlds. And so a key ontological task in my research and practice is to combat notions of bounded individualism and hierarchical valuing of humans. So rather than consider humans as the so-called measurable things, I try to imagine a flatter relational ontology. And so a strategy for doing this is considering that we always already live as part of a more than human world. With this movement in thought comes the idea of entanglement, and it's through webs of relation and entanglement that life flows. So rather than sitting with dualistic divides like humans and nature, it's humans as part of a more than human world. And when we look at things specifically, it's always a process of relations. And so as I delve further into my presentation, I ask the question, is adventure an anthropocentric concept, or is adventure an anthropocentric practice? And how might we approach adventures beyond the self? And so a conceptual strategy of mine is to pay attention to the multiple more than human narratives that run through our sites of outdoor adventure. And it's acknowledging that places of adventure belong to more than just us humans. And so this sort of fits with some of the movements in outdoor literature that I guess are engaging with place-based and place-responsive pedagogies. And part of my research in this realm has also acknowledged that even some place-based approaches can be anthropocentric and implant some ontological divides. And so this idea of more than human stories is what I've developed, encouraged by Haraway and amongst many other feminist, new materialists and post-humanist scholars. I've come to this idea of more than human stories as something that we might engage with as outdoor adventurers or educators in an outdoor adventure realm. And so to take this concept of more than human stories further, I've thought, how might we read landscapes and how might we read more than human stories within a landscape? And so I come to this notion that landscapes have stories to tell. And so just like words in the pages of a book might tell us something, features in a landscape might also tell us something. And so features might be left unattended. They might be left as a backdrop to our adventures, and we might focus on our own experience. But I see that could be an act of silencing. And so if we attend to the features of a landscape and the material signs that those features might be, it can help open up some of the stories of the place. And so what dominant human influences might we see impacting our places of adventure? And how can we attend to environmental problems and environmental precarity through adventure? And so when I look at a landscape, I ask myself, what do I see? And this is what I ask my students as well. What do you see here in this landscape? What features speak to you? What features might tell you something? And so we don't all see the same things when we look at a landscape, because our worldviews, our cultural literacies, our modes of attentiveness all influence what we do. Also, the activities that we're participating in and our modes of travel also impact how we pay attention and influence what we might notice in any landscape. So for me, it's a nuanced practice that I'm definitely still working on, but encouraged by the post-humanist literature and authors such as Donna Haraway, I've been working at ethically attending to the landscapes that I work. And so it was my intention with this presentation today that I would share a number of examples from my research and from my practice, but 10 minutes goes quite quickly. And so I'll touch on one example quite briefly so that I don't go over time. And so one of these examples of reading more than human stories in the landscape comes from the Australian Alps. And so, yes, Australia has mountains and we have snow in winter, and the Australian Alps is a place where I spend a lot of my time and do a lot of my work. And so the Australian Alps is also a popular tourist destination. And I'm going to touch on one particular more than human story that is quite complex and contested and problematic, and that's to do with introduced horses, otherwise known as wild horses, brumbies, feral horses, or pests. They have lots of different labels depending on your worldview and from what perspective you come to the issue with. And they're seen as a contentious issue because on one hand, on the image on the right-hand side, is near the headwaters of the Murray River, and that's Australia's longest river. And this damage here is caused by these horses. There's lots of pugging and wallowing and environmental damage that these horses cause. So on one hand, they're seen as a pest species, but then on the other hand, on the left is sort of more of the romantic image of horses in this landscape. Horses they were introduced by pioneers, by early settlers, and they're seen as part of the cultural imaginary of Australia and celebrated in poems and in movies and from certain cultural circles. And so for me as an educator, taking students into these places, and even beforehand when I worked as a ski instructor up in these alpine areas, horses was this contentious issue, and we would encounter either signs of horses or horses themselves or other aspects of the landscape, whether it's plant communities or species that are impacted by the horses. And so these alpine landscapes are quite fragile. And so whether you come from the perspective of valuing horses or valuing the native aspects of the environment, or whether you consider the multiple worlds that are implicated, whether it's the horses and their worlds, or whether it's some of the endangered and critically endangered species that live up in the Australian Alps that call that place home. There's multiple worlds at play that overlap and cause these problematic conditions, and from the human perspective, lots of debate, but from the perspective of, say, horses or other native species, lives are at stake. And so this necropolitical struggle in the Australian Alps surrounding the place of introduced species and native species, horses and the landscape. And so it's quite a messy story, and it's a complex story. And so for me, when I go to these places with my students, it's about attending to the different features in the landscape and saying, well, what might this scene of the headwaters of the Murray River tell us about this issue? Or what might encountering horses in the snow, what might this tell us about the issue? And it's about opening this dialogical relationship with the landscape, with the different features and inhabitants of that landscape, and also my students. And I think that that's something that More Than Human Stories can offer outdoor environmental education, but also adventure education and adventure tourism. That it doesn't have, it's a societal issue in these areas, the problem of horses. And so the whole community would value from a nuanced but broader understanding, but a nuanced understanding of this complex issue. And so for me, engaging with stories is not just looking at human perspectives and human issues, but considering the more than human worlds and the more than human stories that run through and implicate these places that we might go to for adventure experiences. So some concluding remarks. I noted earlier on that adventure in the Anthropocene might mean using adventurous activities as an entryway into ethical conversations surrounding socio-environmental problems. And this issues of horses was the one example that I've raised, but there's multiple other issues, whether it's climate change or tourism impacts or the impacts of alpine resorts and countless other issues that we might engage with in a landscape. And by reading the different stories in the landscape, we might open up these conversations. And for me, it's about challenging anthropocentric values and considering the more than human worlds that are implicated in these places. And that's something that I think that outdoor adventure experiences might offer, is a chance to open up an ethical conversation around some of these issues. And so as I leave the presentation today, I'll leave you with a few questions that might spark some conversation. Do we think that adventure is an anthropocentric practice? And if we do think that adventure is an anthropocentric practice, how might we de-anthropocentrize adventure? And for me, More Than Human Stories has been a pedagogical strategy for doing this. And I look forward to hearing what other people think and have to say. Here's a reference list that I'll leave you with. It draws upon some of the research that I've conducted that I touched upon in this presentation and some of the other sources that I've cited. But I just want to say thank you very much for listening, and hopefully that this presentation adds something to the conversation today, and hope the rest of the webinar goes well. Thank you very much.
Dominic, that was fantastic, I thought. So that rounded off a superb series of presentations. Just thought I'd check if our other presenters might have showed up, but I can't see that they have. Is that right, Jelena? Am I right in my assessment? No. Okay, so we can open it all up for questions and comments. So just excuse me for rattling my pages, but quite a long day, so I'm just trying. I've got some memory joggers written down here. I'm just, and I suppose just to kick things off, I'm wondering about whether part of what Chris and Josh and Hin and Scott have been talking about are effectively a nudge towards new epistemes, maybe a critique of the role of or the social construct that is adventure in the Anthropocene, and lots of other stuff. But I'm not going to hog it. I'll let you lot dive in. And what have you got? What have you got to say? Yeah, Frida.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm a guest here. I just found your webinar by coincidence. So thank you for letting me join. I'm a PhD at the UiT, the Norwegian Arctic University, and I'm doing research on how nature guides can contribute to more sustainable nature-based tourism in northern Norway. And I have used Donna Haraway and also the concept of more than human in wildlife tourism in the study of seabirds. But also this winter, I will use this concept in the study of dog sledding. So if someone have any input there, I will gladly take it. But also how to de-anthropomorphize whale tourism, because we have a very problem now this whale season that a lot of cowboy guides and boats are surrounding the whales, and there's especially the tourists who love orcas, for example. They are the ones who often go too close. In similar, like the wildlife photographers go too close to the birds. And one way to see this is that they anthropomorphize the animals and they say, well, they are so curious and they only like us humans. They like to be close. And when I was diving with the whales, we had a connection. But this, from a biologist perspective, they say that this is not true, that the orcas don't care and you will actually be in the way. So my question is, how can we effectively communicate to guests that by interpretation, for example, that this is not true, that they will have more respectful way of looking at the more than human, because the guidelines that the DMOs have developed, it doesn't work. And the regulations in Norway, they don't demand that the boats are acting upon the guidelines. Thank you.
So it's a question really about practice and practical responses, isn't it, to these issues? Any suggestions apart from codes of practice?
I have a question, which is, do orcas care, and if so, what do they care about? It seems to be a little privileging humans to be the only species on the planet that care about things. So I'm not with the biologists, perhaps, that Frida you're mentioning. And I'd be curious how to avoid anthropomorphism, but at the same time, not to objectify the other in that process. Yeah, I know that there's a place where I kayak with the grey seals, that they come and play with the kayaks. I don't know why they do it, but they choose to do it. They hit the toggles with their nose. They try and climb out on the boats. They play hide and seek with the kayakers, and they're behaving in that way for some reason. I wouldn't be clear what that reason is, but they're certainly yeah, they are interacting.
Can I just give a quick comment?
I'll finish. Yeah, please. I'd love to hear your view.
They come into the fjords here because of the big schools of herring.
Yeah.
So that's what they're doing here. They're eating and they don't want to be disturbed. And they are also mating at this point in the season. So it's a very sensitive time for them, and they shouldn't, they can be disturbed while doing these important behaviors. And orcas are predators, so they're not like seals or dolphins.
Yeah, I wonder if part of that, I think that what Chris, you were nudging towards, is that it's within this wider context. You know, the being with. It's not about being with orcas to the same extent as it's what are orcas being with. They're being with the ocean and their food and their mate and so on. And perhaps it's encouraging a wide, as far as we can understand the world of the orca at all, then it's encouraging that. But it's an interesting issue, and I know it's one that we faced on the west coast of Scotland quite a bit, actually with seals as well. Okay, any other comments? Or yes, Scott, Josh.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really difficult kind of topic, because you have these kind of possibly like major clashes in, you know, the needs of the tourists and the tour operators versus the needs of the whales. I mean, I'm not quite sure, because I know that the laws are, you know, also if you get into it with like whaling and like drilling here in Norway, there's a lot of detrimental impact on the animals, like on the, you know, the sea animals in a variety of ways, with these like loud noises that are going, I don't know the technical terms, but shooting through the water and stuff like that. I've heard about boats bothering schools of whales. So, I mean, it's a pretty big question, because you also have to wonder, would this be something in another context that would be considered like animals, you know? And how, you know, I'm thinking as a tour guide, like sometimes, you know, how would you explain that to tourists? Oh, we're on a tour. This is actually what we're, you know, doing. This is the biology behind it. This is the story behind it. And it would be a tough thing to probably sell to a tour operator, to explain stuff like this to tourists in like a frank way, perhaps. So it's but I mean, and like you said, the laws are kind of open, because my first thought was that this sounds like it could be a legal issue. Yeah. That's what I think.
That could be the obvious way of managing it, is to, you know, to legislate. But the interesting point you've made there about tour operators, and their people are making money out of it, so that it ushers in this. We've been talking about the Anthropocene, but the sort of what Haraway is particularly critical of is what she calls the Capitalocene, and that humankind justifies much of its actions in the pursuit of this ethereal concept called money and capital, and how that works. So it's really maybe a little bit about what I'd like to push towards in the later discussions, you know, about new epistemes, new ways of knowing that can maybe encourage us to rethink those relationships that you've just mentioned, Frida. Are you up in Alta?
Yes, I'm in Alta, and I've also studied in Sogndal. I heard you were there.
Yes, yeah, I am at the moment. Yeah, I don't know why I looked over my shoulder, just to make sure that I still am, I suppose. Yeah.
Me and June, that is the username JR. We are also in Alta. Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. Okay. Other questions, folks? Hello, Carl.
Hello. I think Tolva's got one, hasn't she?
Yeah, Tolva. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. So, you know, this question that you're asking in the very beginning, Pete, is a really big question, right? And it's an ethical question. And I think everyone has touched on it to some extent. And we have discussed so far, really, the role of the teacher or the guide, which I think is important, because that's one of the things that we offer in adventure tourism. But if we think about adventure more broadly than that, what about those situations where we don't have a guide or we don't have a teacher? You know, do we who are working on adventure, do we still have an obligation to think on those terms? And I just want to bring up two examples. So one is CLUI, which is the Center for Land Use Interpretation. Do you guys know that museum? It's a museum in the United States where what they've done is they've looked at what are the ridiculous things that humans have done on the Earth's surface, and then they've marked them and interpreted them, and they are all over the country. So it's the largest museum in the United States. It covers the entire country. And for example, where the Nola Gay, where they were dropping bombs to practice, right? For example, that is an interpreted area. You go into like a barrack, and then there's a little story that goes with it that just tells you how ridiculous it was. Or those arrows that made out of concrete that were 30 feet long to guide the planes before we had other navigational tools, right? So these kinds of things. And what happens is that I think the point of CLUI is for us to look at those things and think, whew, you know, that is too much. And in a sense, it sort of takes the Anthropocene head on, and then shakes us up to have those ethical conversations thereafter. But then the other side of it is this, you know, if we want to look at nature on nature's terms, you know, how do we mark that? So how do we in the adventure area, do we make an effort to tell the stories in ways with, I don't know, with signs or with whatever it is it takes in order for people to get these messages without having us needing to be there, right? So I guess that's that's my main question is, what about when the guide's not there, the teacher's not there? Do we have an obligation, and what are the good strategies with that obligation? Does that make sense?
Kind of, but then if there's no one there, how could that possibly occur other than, I don't know, just something within wider consciousness?
Well, with signs, for example, the Alaska Highway cuts through huge parts of Canada and Alaska, and they've chosen to tell a story along that road, and they've created spots where you stop and you learn different parts of that story. However, that story is very human. It's not a very the other lots of syllable, lots of consonants, word, thing, scene, Haraway, scene. I don't know that word, but it's not on those terms, it's on the Anthropocene terms, right? But are there other stories we can tell in that way, for example, where people travel, where people move?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I get that. Different ways of actually setting up, you know, maybe we almost talk about conversations with nature and the earth. I always come back to this. I remember a sea kayak guide when I was learning to sea kayak for my PhD, and it was just those moments where they just sit on a rock, gather you round, and start drawing things in the sand to explain how you should paddle without falling in, and that kind of thing. And very, very simple stuff like that. And a week later, you're starting to understand the magnetic suck of the moon on the tides and so on. And though I just wonder whether really very simple, but at the same time unbelievably complex processes like that begin to switch people on to other forces in the world, rather than purely this human-centric attitude, anthropocentric attitude to how the world appears to work. Because I think that's it. It's the new epistemes or recovering old. I mean, that's a problem in my own terminology. It's not a new episteme. You know, we've had presentations about Aboriginal lands, and actually this morning I was teaching about Nigel Thrift's ideas about the pre-conscious understandings of how things work. So those could be also considerations, and those of you that are outdoor guides, facilitators and inspirers might well have something to say about that. Anyone help me out here? Chris.
Following on your sea kayaking theme and also Tova's remarks, it reminded me of a guided sea kayaking trip I did in Vancouver Island, where the guides have to do a month-long training before they're allowed to guide in any national park. And if they want to guide in another national park, they have to do another month-long training to get that license. And there's a lot of knowledge that they gain about the environment, about the culture, about the history of the colonization of that land, the deforestation, the ethnic cleansing, a whole bunch of things. And then how that comes across in their guiding was fascinating to me. Each day he would watch us and he would listen and notice what it was we were noticing. And if we started to notice the birds in the trees, the bald eagles, the hummingbirds, he'd say, okay, and tomorrow we go here. And then you'd find that here was a great place to see all kinds of birds. And then if we were noticing the starfish under the water, the next day he'd say, okay, we go here.
Mi sto guardando l'ultimo quarto d'ora. Era dalle 3 alle 5, non alle 5. Mi è venuto in mente di guardare a che ora era.
A bit overspoken.
Mannaggia, potevo...
Oh, there we go. And eventually, we asked him about any sea mammals that might be in the area. And he said, okay, tomorrow. And we got to go and see a sea lion colony. And we said, so how many groups? I mean, this is obviously intentional and deliberate work on his part. We said, how many groups get to see the sea lions, even though they live here and they're here all year round? And he said, maybe 1 in 10. Because if they don't actually show an interest, I'm not going to show them. So you had to steal the knowledge from the guide. And once you understood the game, it was really empowering to get you to look around and see. So when we first saw a sign that there had been indigenous people living in the area, that suddenly we were saying, look, what's that? And suddenly the next day, we had a whole interpretation of the indigenous history of the islands. And I thought that was and that's how they're taught to do it, by these national park courses. And then you have, I don't know, Frida, if that could ever be something in the north of Norway, but then you have the right to be able to take that license away and say, well, you're not behaving properly. Come back when you're ready to behave in a way that respects the life here, but also engages people with that life in appropriate ways.
That's a really good account. Very interesting way of approaching some of these issues. Tove, you want to come back there, and then Josh.
Yeah, so I just want to say just very briefly, so that I like this idea of them catching what you were interested in and then serving you something in relation to that. And I'm just thinking about, I'm still thinking about the driving through these large swaths of nature, which I think lots of people, for some that's as close as they get. And when there's a sign with a bear on it, you're looking for bears, right? It's a really simple thing. And but if we don't have signs that, so I'm just thinking about what is it that we want people to see? Like, how do we signal that? How do we let them know that there's an opportunity to see a bear? In Norway, we don't have signs like that really. Moose and reindeer, that's all you can see on the side of the road. But there's much more interesting stuff on the side. It's just that they're not going to come running out in front of the car, for example, right? So it's nice to think, how do you signal the opportunity for interest? And then how do you answer to that? I mean, I think those are two interesting things that go together.
Thank you. Yeah, interesting. I think signposting and what was it you said, Chris? Because it's one of the things that Ingold writes about wayfaring and those sorts of things. But signposting as well can be part of that. I just wonder. Yeah, go on. Were you going to say something about that, Chris? You're muted.
Sorry, yeah, just there's a balance there, isn't there, as well? And responding to Josh's points about spontaneity and the dynamics and the opportunity of nature to be the teacher, which often crops up unexpectedly and catches us all by surprise and engages us all in that moment of sudden appearance, like when the moose crosses the road and you've never seen one before. So there is a balance there. There is a nature reserve in Torbay where it says on the sign, and in the bush on your right, you'll hear a blackbird singing. And as you do, you trip an ultra array that goes across the path, and a microphone, a loudspeaker switches on and plays the song of a blackbird. Even in the middle of winter, it does this. So, yeah, getting that right is good, but I really like the idea of alerting people of what to look out for. And apps, these QR codes now really give you a lot of opportunity to do that in quite an informed way, and give a lot of knowledge through an app on a mobile phone through a QR code. Something that's being explored a lot now in the Lake District to interpret. So you don't just get the experiential knowledge, you get the story that's hidden in the landscape, and you need a storyteller to hear it. Yeah.
That's an interesting point. I've got a half-formed thought here, so I'll launch it out, as I usually do, launch it out anyway. Probably be rubbish, but I'm thinking about the Deleuzian idea of imbrications, and I guess I'm concerned about the idea of a sign doing that. What was Scott talking about? He was talking about voices that are silenced, oppressed, absent. And in human geography literature, you'll hear about, you know, ghosts in the landscape and this sort of thing. So and actually having just been teaching on a PhD course here, when we decide which signs to put up, we are inevitably also creating ghosts of the other bits and pieces, I suppose, or at least the other bits become absent because we celebrate. It's like, you know, the Visit Scotland talks about red deer, otters, and, you know, a handful of other things. And meanwhile, you know, you've got animals that you might see elsewhere, but they're in a wild mountain stream, like a dipper, my favorite bird, which is also Norway's national bird, I think. But so these imbrications, these layers of place, in some ways, I suppose that nods towards Haraway's idea of, you know, the kind of string theory, the intertwined or rhizomic aspects of nature and connection and geology and the universe and so on. Anyway, enough from me. Josh.
Yeah, just to respond to a lot of the things that have been said in the past, I don't know, 10 minutes or so. It was going back to Chris's story from British Columbia, and these guides that spent a lot of time out in the wilderness, you know, really, you know, learning and connecting and understanding the area for a long time. This kind of resonates with me as a tour guide here in Norway. I mean, I'm not from Norway, I'm from Florida. I'm from about as opposite place you can get. Here, Norway's mountainous, cold, dark. Florida is flat, tropical, and warm. But you know, before I became a guide here, I learned a lot through the studies. I learned a lot just being here, meeting people. So it wasn't exactly like an organized training before, but what I can connect to your story and these guides is that you did a certain kind of marinating in the stew for a long time. You did to really connect with the landscape, whether it's a city, an urban, a concrete jungle or whatever, which Oslo kind of is, or the forest if you go out into the forest. But it just makes me think, like, yeah, what would make that guide, or what would make me say, oh, look at this, or let's talk about this, or oh, it is this game, it is this kind of dance, but it also kind of comes from being so connected with the land that you're not just sitting there, oh, I've got this fact and I've got this thing, I've got this bag of tricks that I can pull out, or this file cabinet in my mind of things, but it's actually that you are kind of an extension of the landscape. And it also makes me think a bit about, if you look at the way that guide is used in a lot of different contexts, like spiritual guides, shamanic guides. I used to live with, was doing research in Ecuador, and I was, with a shaman, and he spent a year, living in the jungle, you know what I mean? And I mean, if this guy takes you out, he's gonna tell you everything about the jungle and understand everything about the jungle. So I mean, it really is, there's all kinds of ways you can guide people around. You can read a pamphlet and sit on a bus and point things out along the way, but that guidance that people can do, that facilitators can do, that is really responsive to the place and the, let's say, the audience, the students, the guests, the whoever. You're almost like an intermediary interpreter between these two worlds, really, the known and like the unknown. You're kind of the negotiator in between. That's kind of how, that's what your story made me think of. So
nice, good stuff. Yeah, and that brings me back to the pre-conscious as well, but also maybe that month-long training period presumably means people have an extremely rich and varied knowledge of landscape and flora and fauna and things. So it becomes a sort of place-based education, and it's a related but separate thing about that we're writing about taxi drivers in Istanbul, which is really kind of got nothing to do with this, apart from the fact that it what you learn from taxi drivers in Istanbul are aside from the objective stories about the city that you get from a tourist brochure. So and we got these narratives from them that said, well, if you really want to know the best place to look at the city at night, there's this sort of hospital garden, and that's where we would go to be with our girlfriends, you know, and many of us propose to our girlfriends in this place. So it's a kind of secret place, that access to a secret tourist place that has meaning and resonance. And I wonder whether we can extrapolate that sort of idea, and you know, we're theorizing that as a way of sort of thickening places.
If I can pick up on a couple of the thoughts here that have just been tossed around, you know, I reacted to Scott's introduction when he was speaking, where he said that he was sensitive to the colonist perspective on the landscape because it was originally indigenous. And then I think, well, that's interesting, because when you talk about these layers of place, right? And so then you have the colonist layer, and then you have the, you know, they have the indigenous layer, but there's so many other layers, right? And so it's interesting how we are, you know, this is really the ethos now, is that we have to acknowledge who was there first, but actually who wasn't there first, right? I mean, so how far do we go in this conversation? And so then I think it's really more interesting perhaps to think not layers of place, but maybe layers of relations, which was brought up by, was that also Scott? But anyway, others have brought that up also. And I think that that's a fair way to twist things a little bit, turn things a little bit on their side when thinking about how we rethink our relationship to or our place in the landscape, the relationship with the place or whatever.
Yeah, it's a great point. I was just wondering, Chris, if you wanted to respond to that a bit, because I like the way you started with the squirrel costumes and the sort of feeling the air and obviously dodging the rock that you're skirting past.
I was thinking, as you were talking about thickening place, about some work that Sue Waite did, where she talked about thinning culture. And I wonder if these two go hand in glove. And the idea of thinning culture was that there was more room for people to play, to be curious, to explore, that whoever was responsible for them, and she was talking about primary school children, leaves more and more space. And the playground is a much thinner space, cultural space, than the classroom, which is a much thicker cultural space. And so in the playground, they have a lot more room to breathe, to notice things, to tell stories to each other, to follow their own agency, their own curiosity. And in doing that, then the body is engaged, as well as the senses, as well as the mind. And so much, I think, of what we've all touched on in this conversation is about the body, which often gets left out and forgotten. You talk about the pre-conscious knowledge, Pete, and I'm suspecting that that's also in this same sort of set of ideas, that we know stuff that we don't know we know until we actually use the muscle that that somehow brings it to mind that there's something going on here that we should pay attention to and learn to read and learn to trust experientially. And that experiential thing then provokes the curiosity to know more, to know the biology, to know the history, to know the relationships, to know that I need to keep back from the whales because it's feeding and breeding time, and that's we shouldn't go too close, to be interactive in an informed way rather than a directed way. But that takes time, doesn't it? It always takes time, as I was kind of suggesting, to become the expert at whatever level of expertise about how to do that. There's a learning process here that the participant, the guest, the student, whatever it is, as Josh was saying, has to become good at in order to be curious, in order to notice, pay attention, and in order to begin to explore those hidden narratives and that deeper knowledge. And I guess one of the things against us in many tourist situations is that we don't have time. Which is one of the reasons why I think bringing some of these things home to more recreational, unguided, unstructured situations, allowing people to develop recreational time in their local communities is so important, because there they can develop those skills over time, and then they can perhaps use those skills to think about how they would develop them in a new place when they're only there perhaps for a holiday. It is epistemological, as you're saying as well, Pete. This is about a different epistemology of our relationship with the environment, and us are paying attention to that knowledge, that experiential knowledge, but also the cultural historical knowledge, and looking outwards rather than looking inwards. Although I have nothing against people spending time in nature to look inwards when that's appropriate. It's a good space for doing it. I think we should also have the skill of being able to look outward and be curious about the world that we're in.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that last caveat, because we've got someone who's just written about forest bathing on the screen. But so I'm just jotting down there things like micro attentiveness as well, sort of looking at an ant's nest and see what goes on there, and the community of ants and how they're interacting with other aspects of nature. So there tends to be a natural modern human search for the spectacular, which happens to be another thing that I'm currently trying to write about. It's taken forever, but the whole obsession with things that are spectacular. So it's got to be a killer whale, it's got to be an eagle, and they're actually all over the place. There are fabulous little creatures and plants and whatever else doing interesting. So it's that micro attentiveness, and so how do we as educators and facilitators stimulate that enthusiasm? What are the tricks? I mean, you've educated lots of outdoor professionals, Chris. So,
well, I just turn people to Steve Van Meter and say, be inspired by that and build on those ideas. He was thinking about just that question 30, 40 years ago, and has written a lot about it in his early books, more so than the books that are sort of a curriculum for ecology, although they're interesting too. His early books, acclimatization and acclimatizing, and he has a whole system. He writes in the first book, as in his introduction, about the problem he used to have in summer camps getting people interested in the lake, because they were all worried about when they were going to get too cold. And he said he learned very quickly that you had to get them beyond what he called the crutch barrier. And once they were up to their waists in the lake, then they were with him, because they weren't thinking about that cold moment that was still to come. And they felt they were in the lake rather than still out of the lake. And that immersion, then he was able to point at some spider crawling across the surface or some pond weeds and get them all around. And then he had lovely ways of working with different senses at different scales from different perspectives. Activities just pour out of those books. He had a colleague called Joseph Cornell as well, who has a raft of these kinds of ways of engaging people using their senses with what's right there, what's right in front of them, and then begin to think about them in terms of bringing to life the ecology of which they are a part, thinking about them situated within that web that Haraway uses. You know, what is the bundle? Somebody talking about bundle of assemblages at some point this afternoon. Karina, I think it was, and her colleague. Yeah, and him, and that just beginning to follow those threads and see where they lead, and as soon as you spark curiosity and you've got past the crutch barrier, then you can stand back and like the blue touch paper, and off it goes.
Can you say again what Steve's? I didn't catch the name. Steve who? Steve
Van Metre, M-A-T-R-E. His books, he's pre-internet, so you don't find his stuff online. So the hard copies are difficult to come by. There's 2 on my shelf here if you're ever in Ulverston. But Earth Education is a book I think that's still quite widely available, which is his sort of organized 3-day program to teach ecology using these experiential methods.
Yes, and I do wonder whether there is, whether we pay enough attention to the ecological componentry of the environment in which many people operate, whether it's for tourism or education, and that more can be done of that. But it also this, so stimulating enthusiasm with our students or our tourist clients, but also how do we stimulate that enthusiasm right throughout the industry as well, rather than pursuing always and entirely the spectacular. That's possibly part of the problem.
It's one of the big challenges here in the Lake District. We want to develop ecotourism, but there's no big spectacle to see. No reliable big spectacle to see. So we have to go to the small and the curious and or we start reintroducing the big spectacles, which is what's going on with the beaver at the moment.
Yeah. Be wolves next, and that'll be hell for the Herdwick.
Well, thank goodness, yes. Same problem as with horses.
Colleagues, other comments or questions? We've actually gone past 2 hours, and it's been extremely stimulating. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Any other comments that you want to?
There's one.
June's got her hand up. I do apologize.
Oh, that's okay. So yeah, my name is June. I'm also from Alta, sitting here together with Frida.
Yeah.
I'm also a guest here, but I've been to the AITRA conference in Ireland. Is it 2 or 3 years ago? I think it's only Carl Cater who knows my PhD. So I'm at my last closing phases of my PhD. Yeah. So I think it was you, Chris, that mentioned the micro attentiveness and how we work with that either as researchers or with students. In my research, I've been connecting. I've been looking at this ski touring, backcountry skiing, which has taken off here in Finnmark, at the coast of Finnmark. And the last alpine region of Norway and Northern Norway, mainland Northern Norway, which is a quite unknown area for most skiers around the world. So in many ways, it's been called the last frontier of skiing, ironically then. But enough of that. I've been following guides, local guides, international guides, local people practicing the outdoors skiing, winter skiing, and also tourists visiting places, going together with these things. So I started to follow these micro processes instead of writing about like adventure or something like that, and tapped into how this moving in avalanche terrain, being attentive to soundscape, to haptic knowing, snow, and all this further developed into how especially the local people started to thin forest to be able to ski all the height meters available, and how that again tapped into reindeer community here. They need to have a little bit open forest to be able to drive the reindeers down the mountains. So it became like a cooperation between different activities in a way. So just a little comment on that, how I kind of follow this, how it went into also biodiversity, questions about the blueberry shrub being overgrown, and how the skiers, because they're locals, of course, they started to cultivate the landscape a little bit in a win-win situation in this what's going on happening right now. And for the other side, I think I want to share a little bit story from our education here, because I've been working as an outdoor teacher for 15 years here in Northern Norway, 20 years, mostly with glaciers, but also lots of sea kayaking. But what we have started to do to get our students to become more attentive to these more than human stories, and to tell other stories, both from landscapes and from cultures and from places. We have actually sent the students out for a month, maybe 2 months, to interview people in landscape and to walk particular stretches of landscape to really get it under their skin, and then to seek up people to talk with. What can this be about? For instance, which I work with avalanche, is my kind of field here in the north. I send the students to talk with fishers and fishermen, and yeah, people generally in the location here. And then they hear stories about that when most of the avalanches, they release when there's a full tide. So that's their observation, because they've been working from the sea their whole life. So a little bit of this, lift up other stories in the landscape. And that's how we believe, I believe, that this is how they get the landscape, the people, and the culture under their skin in a way. Yeah, that was just a long comment.
It was a fantastic stuff. Yeah. So that last bit about the avalanches, their observation is that more avalanches occur at high tide. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, at high tide. So that's from working with fish in the fish industry. But what it translated into, again, following the story and the practice, what that translated into, when I grew up at the coast in the 90s, when we started driving a lot more. My grandparents, for instance, told me that I could not drive home from the cabin on high tide, because then it would more likely to release an avalanche. So that's the takeaway at that part of my life. Now we know a little bit more, of course, but yeah.
It's probably not. Yeah, it's probably not the sea, is it? It'll be some kind of magnetic force again from elsewhere, the moon.
Yeah.
But that's fascinating. Now, there's something that I've not picked up as chair, I suppose, summarising some of this, and everyone has talked about stories and storytelling, and actually in every presentation that's come up, and in every comment, the idea of storying, and Haraway is talking about storying stories and so on. And I guess we're not going to have time. It's already quarter past 6 here in Norway, but I suppose it's another theme, and I'd also like to ask you whether there are a bunch of key words we'd like to summarize from this series of presentations that we might want to see at our forthcoming conference or any other seminars that we hold online or face to face. So whether we pick up particular things like new or old revisited epistemes about how the world works. I would suggest that's a possibility, and then this stuff that we've been dealing with about sort of the micro worlds and micro attentiveness to the environment and nature, and how we reconnect with a completely different sort of adventuring self. But what else? Anyone offer some suggestions for our word list, and tell me if you don't agree with what we got. Stories.
One thing you said when you said here about when we started talking about the micro attentiveness and micro worlds, that comes back to the first set of presentations, which were about micro adventures, right? They're linked. They definitely can be linked.
Sure. Yeah. But then it is taking it beyond that, and the stories and the perhaps the anthropocentric knowing and understanding. Do we may also want to talk about the non-human from the perspective of the non-human, as much as that's possible? Of course, Haraway has set us a tremendous challenge.
Yeah, I guess that's my main sort of critique. I think just sort of in looking at I haven't read stuff in detail since early Haraway, which I had to do for undergraduate degrees, but but it goes back to your epistemological sort of stances and the ways of knowing, and then looking at what Tove was saying about the layers as well. That sort of rang true, is that there are multiple layers, and we have to. This is great terrain because we're open to these layers, but there will be layers that we'll never understand and never be able to access. And I think that's a pretty important acknowledgement, that we can't possibly know what it's like to be, I don't know, some of these, natural phenomena. So I think there are limits, aren't they? But whether we need to sort of acknowledge those. Yeah.
And is it someone waiting to come in?
With the unknown, right? There's adventure right there.
Well, absolutely right. And I think one of the things that one of the human responses has been to anthropomorphize those ants, and refer to this little ant as, look what he's doing now, and he's taking food back for his family, and all those sorts of stories. Now, I wouldn't necessarily argue that they should never happen, because they can help to engage young people in what's going on under their noses and so on. Who was this shows my age. Was it Johnny Morris?
Animal Magic.
There you go. Yeah. So Johnny Morris used to bring these things to life, but it was entirely sort of anthropomorphizing.
Yeah, very, very much so. Yeah. I really like the idea of the storytelling as well, and as a theme, or storying, because I think it would be good to do storytelling and story making, because if we're seeking new epistemologies, then we can work with everybody to help build the new stories. And people are much more likely to own a story that they've made themselves and take it and share it perhaps elsewhere.
Yeah. And two of your colleagues, I can't remember where we were, Carl might remember, who were talking about the ways that maps confine thinking, and they did this exercise where they sent people off without maps. Totally irresponsible, well, there you go. But they came back and told stories about where they'd been, which were far richer.
Yeah, that was Jamie McPhee and Nigel Dykes.
Yeah.
Fantastic stuff. So it'd be great to hear updates on that sort of thinking.
That was in the Picos de Europa where they were doing that work. I think our Spanish colleague has gone, but they would set students loose in the mountains of the Picos without maps for several days.
Fabulous stuff, and it was a great presentation, as
and we counted them all out, and we counted them all back. So.
I'm sure you did. Okay, folks. Any other? Yeah, June, you got your hand up.
No, it's probably lower hand.
Okay, Legacy. Anybody else? Any final comments? No.
I just wanted to say thank you for putting all this on, Pete, and I know there's another one to go, which I'm now going to sign up to if I possibly can. And it was lovely to meet so many folks, particularly from Scandinavia and from Norway. I think a long holiday and a big tour is called for, from top to bottom.
Absolutely.
You're welcome. Let us know when you are here.
Oh, thank you so much, Frida. And anybody coming to the Lake District, you'd be very welcome to drop into Ambleside to the campus, and it would make you feel at home, to follow the theme of my presentation. Yeah.
Well, actually, with the characters we've got on the screens now, I think we've got people dotted all along the length of Norway. So yeah. you've got a tour ready made right there.
Yep. And Josh and Becca as tour guides.
Come on a bike tour. Anybody's in Oslo, stop by. I'm always happy to talk about this kind of stuff and have a coffee or go for a walk. It's very nice around here.
Yeah. And I can take you for a pub crawl, but in Sondal, that's not a very long pub crawl. There's only 3.
You have to take out a loan.
That's everything, apart from to thank Jelena, who really is the behind the scenes engine for all of this, has been looking after me and everybody else with their presentation. So thank you, Jelena. Well done. Kept it all together, kept us to time and all the rest of it, although we're miles over it now. I'm going off to eat rakfisk. Am I saying that correctly? Yeah, what not quite. Go on then, Frida.
Rakfisk.
Rakfisk. Okay.
Or at least here. Good luck. I don't like it. It's a very special taste.
Yeah, a bit of fermented fish and some akvavit anyway. So I'd better go off to dinner. But that was really stimulating. To our speakers, thank you so much. Really, really stunning stuff.
Thank
Absolutely.
you.
And I know that Scott will be watching this because it's being recorded afterwards. So thank you, Scott. Very, very stimulating work. And by the way, I forgot to mention that you can post questions to Scott on his presentation, which was I thought was fascinating. So I shall get in touch with you separately, Scott. What else? There is another conference coming up, but it is on the other side of the world, so we're going to have a think about how we do that, and how that works. But watch this space. Keep an eye on the ATRA website, and you'll see details of that. So it's the New Zealand conference, postponed for the last 2 years. So was it 2 years? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So
just Chris did mention briefly, but of course to plug next week, this is the middle one, but we've still got another session next week, but we're on a slightly earlier time, 10 o'clock next Wednesday, with some great speakers as well. It looks good.
Yeah. Are you chairing that one, Carl?
Yeah, it's myself and Adele. So I mean, it is, yeah, for that one we focused on sort of upcoming, researchers, stuff under development and people doing PhDs and stuff. But I think there's some really interesting stuff there.
Yeah, looks brilliant. I wasn't able to attend the first one, so but it looks good. Okay, everybody, have a pleasant evening. I think we're all in the more or less the same time zone. So yeah, wish me luck with the rockfisk.
Good luck. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Hello.